What's up, gangsters? It's a fine, sunny Sunday afternoon out here at Rube Goldberg Enterprises, and it is time for another one of my favorite kind of videos, a project done video. If you keep up with any of my nonsense, you may know that a couple of months ago, I started on the Heller 1/24th scale Ferguson te-20 tractor. And I've been working on it steadily. I'm surprised at how long it's taken me. It turned out to be a little more intense than I expected it to be, which is, of course, as usual, mostly drama of my own making. But it actually was fairly drama-free. Until today, that is. I've had a little bit of drama today, but I'll tell you about that later. Anyway, this has been really a fun kit. It's fun for me because I'm a farm kid, and I, spent more than a few summer days driving a little tractor much like this. The Ford 8N is a close cousin of the little Ferguson, so kind of a little bit of an emotional attachment to this subject. And tractor kits are just not very plentiful, so I was anxious to see what Heller had on offer. And while it's not a perfect kit, it certainly is a fun one and not a bad one. And you can use it as a base for all kinds of detailing and weathering and really, create whatever kind of tractor look you're after, whether that be a brand new tractor or one that's like what I was trying to. Oh, there we go. I have to apologize for my compressor because a couple of days ago, I think the pressure shutoff switch has developed a leak, and so now it's coming on like every 10 minutes. And I don't have the force of personality like my buddy Matt McDougall to just tell it, shut up, compressor, and have it do as it's told. So, yeah, that's going to be a little annoying. Hopefully we'll get through it without too much of that. Anyway, what I'm trying to depict here is a little tractor that's, going on 50, 60 years old, but still seeing regular use around the farm for, small jobs like grading or, mowing or whatever, because that's pretty common with these little tractors. They last forever, and you will see them in all levels of condition, from the perfectly restored to the well ass whipped like this one. So anyway, that's what I was trying to do, and now it's time to take a look at some pictures and see if I actually managed to pull it off. Okay, so there you have it. That is my depiction of a little old Ferguson FF30, actually. That's one thing that I think I mentioned in the previous segment, is that you can build this as the te-20, which was the original version, or the later version, which was called the FF30, and that's when they went to the red and gray color combo. So anyway, that's what I'm figuring is like an early 1950s vintage, maybe. Anyway, to kind of start up with where I left off on the first segment with talking about the kit itself. When I left off with my first segment, I was kind of in my head thinking that this kit might get like a 90 in my sort of little mental scorecard system, where I look at fit, engineering, molding, the amount of detail, and the execution of the detail. And I, as is usual with these things, the score has fallen a little bit as I got out of the honeymoon phase, but not fallen too far. I would still give this kit overall like an 80, 85 maybe. And the reasons that the score kind of fell are relatively simple, and they had to do with engineering. Overall, this is a pretty nice little kit. It is sparse on detail, I feel, but the detail that's there is well executed. Everything is very crisply molded. The fit is good, albeit in a few places the fit is a little bit loose, which can get you into a little bit of trouble. But overall, it really is a well-done kit, and I think, like I said, it's a good basis for having lots of fun. Now, where it kind of does fall down, though, is in a couple of specific places on engineering. One is on this radiator assembly, and I'm going to attempt to fetch the instruction sheet out from under the pile of stuff that's grown on top of it, and so I can show you kind of one little gotcha in here. As you can see early on in the kit, what they want you to do is right here in step number 4, that part number B26 goes into a slot on the front of the chassis. And that's a fairly loose fit, and that's important because you see the pins on either side of that little part. Those are what the hood is supposed to hinge on later if you want to try and make the hood actually flip up the way that it does on the real thing. And you can also see that there's a couple of semicircular notches in the front of that part. And what goes there is the radiator. And they don't really show that very well right here, but the radiator has a couple of round pegs on the bottom of it that fit into those two notches. Now, because the fit on this part right here is pretty loose, it's easy to get it crooked and not even realize it until later when you go to put the radiator on, and then you see that the radiator is crooked. And also because of these pins being there for the hood, that also affects the fit of the hood itself, although we'll see that ends up sort of being a non-issue anyway. So, my recommendation is, if I were going to do this kit again, I would actually try and temporarily attach the radiator to that part B26 when I was in this stage of the build, so that I could make sure that everything was nice and, oh, there goes compressor again, so that I could make sure that everything was nice and square at this point. Because what I ended up having to do when I discovered that mine was totally crooked was, after I already had the radiator on, everything was all painted, I had the front axle beam on there, and I ended up having to very carefully come in underneath and saw that tab in half to release that part and straighten it up and reattach it with some super glue. And that was a fun little bit of drama. Ended up not being too bad, but definitely the kind of thing that you're better off not having to do. Now, speaking of the hood, I actually was reading a thing on Facebook from a guy who built one of these and did a really nice job. And he talked about the fact that he could not get the hood to go on properly because it kept hitting on the radiator cap. And he ended up cutting the radiator cap off and just gluing the hood on. Now, I wasn't willing to do that because I put a lot of work into all of this engine detail. And so I was bound and determined that my hood was gonna open. So after I corrected the position of the radiator, I found that indeed the radiator cap was an interference. And I ended up having to remove a lot of material from the inside of the hood, you can see there. Even so, it was not enough to allow the hood to drop onto these hinge pins. And even if it had been, there really isn't any way to get the hinge pins to go into the hood where those holes are because they're obviously a little wider than the hood, and there's no flex here. The only way you'd have any flex is if the sides of the hood were not glued in place. So it's sort of a physical impossibility. And I just really don't feel like this was very well thought out by the Heller guys. What I think they should have done was give you a couple of holes in these bosses right here so that you could drop the hood on and then put a couple of pins inside there once you had everything in position so that the hood would flip up. Now, as it turns out, I decided after kind of fiddling around with it that having the hood only sort of open that much wasn't really what I wanted anyway. And given the difficulty of all of it and the fact that I was never going to get the pins in there to operate as a hinge anyway, I decided to just blow it off. And I installed one of my handy Tamiya magnets from one of my other kits in the top of the radiator cap, and put a tiny little piece of photo etch steel, also from a Tamiya kit, inside the hood there. And so now, as you'll see momentarily, the hood goes on there and it just sort of pops into place because of the magnet, and that works pretty well. I think I can go ahead and put it back on because I think I've talked about pretty much most of this detail that I added in the first segment. One thing that I did try to do that I know I didn't talk about in that first segment was add some battery post terminal clamps. And let me find something here to point with. You can see those, and I got these from Detail Master. They were the only ones that I could find, and you can see they're photo etch parts. And I don't know if you can tell, but they are flat because they're photo etch. And I had to stack up like 3 or 4 of them to get any thickness at all, and they still look kind of ridiculous. And if any of you guys know of anybody making 1/24 scale battery terminal clamps in resin, I would love to know about it, because there's no reason that they shouldn't be able to make those with really good detail, given the tiny resin parts that are found on in a lot of detail kits and things like that. I know they could do it, and it would be really nice to have some that were better. These, they'll do, but I'm not super happy with them. Also, I got the battery terminal cables from Detail Master because they were red and black already, and I thought, well, that'll be convenient. Turns out they're copper wire, and they're just way too stiff to be really well workable. So can't say that I would recommend those. Another thing that I did that I was pretty happy with is I had to have some hose clamps. You can see on the radiator hoses, got some clamps there. Also around here on the other side, there is an air boot or a connector to the air inlet on the carburetor. And so what I did to make those is, for that air inlet clamp, which is a big rubber sleeve on the real thing, I just wrapped a piece of Izu tape around it that was, I think that's the 2mm tape. Then I used my 0.4mm Izu tape that I painted with my Molotow chrome markers to give them a nice silver look. And I just wrapped those around each of my hoses in the right place and gave them a little dab of thin super glue. and created hose clamps that way. A really easy way to create a nice hose clamp. The Molotov chrome pin does a good job on those, even though it doesn't retain its chrome look once you have added a dull coat or whatever. But it's a really simple way to make a nice looking hose clamp. So that's definitely a method that I'll be using more often. Let's see, I don't know if I had talked about detailing the exhaust pipe in the last segment. I don't think I did. Anyway, I put a lot of work into that because on the real thing, and they didn't, I think now that I'm thinking about it, I think I did talk about that. They don't give you any detail in the kit on that exhaust pipe. So I wanted to try and recreate the U-bolt style clamps that are sometimes found on those, and so I used some wire and little pieces of sheet styrene and some little resin bolt heads for those. So I think that turned out fairly well, and of course the brass tubing that I talked about to replace the top part of it. Speaking of bolt heads, that's one of the things where I put a lot of effort in on this thing. There are probably 30 of these little bolts, resin bolts or bolt heads scattered around the model. And they are from Master Club. And I don't think I showed those before, but this is an example of what they look like. And these things are fantastic. The detail on them is just really, really good. And I was lucky enough that Matt Bull from Hobby World USA sent me this little thing, this card that shows all of the available bits of hardware that Master Club makes. So you can see there's round-headed rivets, there's regular bolt heads, there's nuts, that are threaded on the end of a bolt, flange head type bolts, flange head type nuts, even acorn style nuts in a bunch of different sizes. And these things are just great. So what I would do is where I wanted to use those in places like on that, like for example, that terminal where the big cable goes to the alternator right there, I would just chop the head off, and I flattened the lead wire right there and glued it on, and then I glued the bolt head on top of it with a little bit of thin CA glue. And that was a strategy that worked pretty well. I used that all over, lots of places on here where I use those. I'm not even sure I can remember all of the places I used them, but I've started to build up a stock of that kind of hardware for just this reason. And I think I value that stash of tiny hardware maybe even more than everything else in my stash. And granted, I don't have a very big stash, but in terms of value per cubic inch of space taken up, these little bits of resin and photo etch hardware that I've been hoarding are really high. So anyway, good stuff. So I think that kind of covers all of the detail work and so forth that I did in the engine area. One thing that I wanted to try to do was give a little bit of a differentiation to the metal on the fuel tank and the radiator. All the rest of this is pretty typical cast steel and sheet steel that's gotten that rusty brown tone to it, but whether it's accurate or not, just for the sake of change, I decided to depict the fuel tank as galvanized steel, and the radiator is either aluminum or also galvanized steel. I'm not sure what it's actually made of, but that's why it shows silver underneath the chipping, as opposed to the rusty brown. Now, speaking of chipping, this is a good time to talk about it, even though I guess I've gotten way off track in talking about kit engineering, but I'll come back to that. Anyway, this whole project for me was a lot about the chipping, and I learned some pretty tough lessons with this one. I have used Mr. Paint for chipping, and as you guys know, that's a pure lacquer. I also used Gun's Mr. Color lacquer on this. All this red is actually Mr. Color. And I learned a tough lesson because on my Hawker Tempest I used Mr. Paint and had great luck with the chipping, but I applied the colors in a much more translucent way on that project because of my strategy. With this thing, because I wanted basically full density colors, I sprayed more layers. And this is one of those things where, chipping is one of those things that goes from 0 to terrible in an oh no second. It either starts coming off, the paint either starts coming off way too quickly, or if you have too many layers on and it's a lacquer like this, it can become very difficult where it doesn't want to come off at all. It's like when you go from 2 layers to 3 layers, it's like that moment when you've been out drinking with your friends and everything is going great and you've got a nice buzz on and it's all fine, and then you decide to have just one more drink, and the next thing you know, you're out in the parking lot on all fours barfing up your cheeseburger. Ask me how I know. That's what happens when you get one too many layers of MRP or Mr. Color on and you start trying to chip it. I had a terrible time getting the paint to come off on the chassis. And what I ended up doing was actually using, very delicately, a sort of combination of Tamiya lacquer thinner and water. And those two don't mix, don't get me wrong. But what I would do is I would very carefully dip my brush into some lacquer thinner, then dip it in the water, and I found that that would start to break the surface very quickly and actually start to smear the surface pretty quickly. But the water would kind of then take over and help keep things under control. If it didn't, if things started to get too crazy too quickly, then what I would do is just immediately stop, get some water on my brush, and go at it like that. And I sort of managed to fumble my way through it and make it work, and got chipping that I was pretty happy with, but there was a little bit of drama in a couple of places where I ended up having to repaint and re-chip because it just didn't work the way it was supposed to. So a strong lesson there. Yes, you can chip using Mr. Paint, MRP, or Guns, Mr. Color. But you do have to be very careful in how heavy you apply the color coats, because as soon as it gets a little bit of that natural semi-gloss sheen to it, that's when you're screwed, because it becomes very difficult for your water to penetrate that, and it's tough. I mean, it stands up to all of the pecking that I was doing at it with all of my various little chipping brushes, and I ended up having to get pretty medieval in a couple of places. But I'll talk more about that when I talk about the sheet metal. Anyway, so back to kit engineering. Another place where I felt like they could have done a little bit better job in giving you more positive assembly was in the front steering setup. This is a situation where basically these Pitman arms should only go on to the top of the steering shaft in one way, but they have a round hole and a round pin, so it's left up to you to get the angle between the Pitman arm and the axle correct, and there's just really no need for that. That's something that should just basically assemble itself correctly. If they wanted to give you a round pin and hole at this end of the Pitman arm so that you could actually have the steering in a pivoted configuration, that's all great. But this other thing should be more straightforward. I also felt like that the loose fit on some of these made it a little bit of a challenge, but ultimately it did all go together fine, so not too big of a deal. The other place where the engineering I felt was a little bit slack was on the rear wheels, and that's in two respects. One is that even though these tires are vinyl, they are a pretty tight fit. And it took a lot of pressure to get the inside and the outside halves of the wheels to come completely together. And they're still not perfect, but I used a lot of clamps on these and a lot of extra thin to get those glued together. So that's just a fit issue. I also discovered at that point that they are not perfectly round. And the inner and outer pieces of the wheels don't exactly match. So that's a little bit of a bummer, but you can't really see the gap too much. It's inside there, at least. It's it's fairly well hidden, so you can't see it too much, not too big of a deal, but that definitely would have been an improvement. Of course, if they just did the entire wheel as a molded resin part, like I was whining about in the first segment, then you wouldn't have that issue. Now, the other place where the engineering falls down a little bit is on the assembly of the rear wheels to the rear axles. And I'll show you in the instruction sheet kind of what I'm talking about. One thing to pay attention to is when you are putting the rear axles on, make sure, if you look, notice that the top half of that part, that's D12, has a little bit of a cutout in that square boss. That's for a tab that goes on, that's on the bottom of the fender, and you'll see that over here. You can see on the bottom of the fender that tab is supposed to plug into that little hole. Yeah, I was just stupid. I wasn't paying attention, and I put those on upside down, so I ended up having to chop the tab off the bottom of the fender and just glue to the flat spot on top of that square boss. Not a big deal, just something to pay attention to. And I feel silly about it because it's shown a number of places in the instructions what the correct orientation is. Anyway, what you'll see is when you put, hold on a second here, when you put the rear wheels on, what they have you do is put the entire disc, or rear, it's not a disc brake, but it is the rear brake assembly, onto the end of the axle, and then assemble the wheel to it. And there's a sort of a little hexagonal shaped cutout on the outside of the wheel hub that matches a hexagonal protrusion on the inside of the wheel itself that you can't really see right there. So the positioning is fairly positive, but it's a little bit loose. And what you find when you go to assemble this is that you can't really see it going together. It just becomes a kind of a blind assembly, and you can kind of feel it pop into place there, but it should be a more positive location. Should be a little bit more of a definite fit to it, in my opinion. But what I feel like they really should have done, because, and this is another embarrassing story, what you may find, and hopefully you don't find out in the terrible way that I did, that joint between the wheel hub and the axle housing is a weak point. And what would be nice, and I think if I were going to do this kit again, what I would do is I would drill the wheel out and the axle, and I would put a brass rod in there so that you had a strong assembly right there on the end of the axle. Anyway, how I found out that was as weak as it was is because I just kind of noticed that once I got to this stage and I had the wheels on and the thing was sitting up on its wheels, that there just was a little bit of flex there, which wasn't too much of a surprise because that's a lot of leverage. You've got this wheel and you've got this moment arm of about an inch or inch and a quarter from the middle of the hub out here to the edge of the tire that's working on a joint that's like 1/8 of an inch. And so I decided, and this is how I get myself into trouble all the time, I decided that what I wanted to do was flood some thin super glue into the thin gap between the backside of the wheel and the hub. No big deal, right? I just laid the tractor over on its side, got my bottle of thin super glue, and just poked the snout in there and let a drop fall in, and it just flooded around the circumference of that, and all was well. In retrospect, I should have been using, a pipette or one of the fancy little tubes that you can get for your bottle of thin super glue that I forgot I had, because when I flipped the tractor over and did the other side, yep, sure enough, I dropped a giant drop of super glue onto the tire, and it immediately ran underneath the tire and glued the damn tractor to the little white towel that I had underneath it. But I didn't realize that, of course, until I went to tip the tractor back over, and the very firmly glued tire stayed put, and the axle started to break on the inside of the hub. Actually at this joint right here. I'll show it to you. Anyway, it was horrifying because it was breaking right there on the inside of the hub, not out here where I now had super glue and everything was super strong. But fortunately for me, it did not come completely loose. It just started to crack before I realized what was going on. So I was able to flood some extra thin in there, get it back up on its wheels, get everything squared up and re-glued and back in shape the way it needed to be. But that's just like the irony of my model making. I invariably, when I have my biggest drama and screw things up the worst, is when I'm like going after that extra little bit and trying to make things even better. And I just do something stupid like that. It's hugely frustrating. It's one of my, it's a serious character flaw is what it is. And it is absolute proof that sometimes the better is the enemy of the good. So yeah, don't do that. Live vicariously through my mistakes. Anyway, all's well that ends well, I suppose. And the little tractor is in good shape, but it is a challenge because, like I said, you've got a lot of leverage on these wheels. There's not really a good place to pick the thing up. And so you have to be careful when you're moving it around. But I have discovered that I have sort of got a way of handling that. And you can see there, yep, now my hood pops right back on. And I've discovered that my blade assembly, combined with a finger underneath the front, is a relatively stable way of picking the thing up. Not great, but not too bad. So let's talk about the blade for a second. The blade is 100% scratch built. And this was a lot of fun for me because it's the first time I'd ever tried to build something complete like that from scratch using just a styrene rod and sheet and bar stock. And we have one of these on our farm, so it was pretty easy to refer to it to see what it should look like, and it was actually a lot of fun. A fairly straightforward build with simple geometry. The only challenge I really had was in how to form the blade into this curved profile, and I went through several experiments with that. I swear I don't know what the deal is. There are plenty of people who say that they have good luck forming styrene with boiling water and steam from their tea kettle and their hairdryer, but I just cannot do it. I don't know if it's because I'm just an idiot or what, but I just can't do it. And what I ended up doing was taking a sheet of 20 thousandths styrene and wrapping it around the shank of a 6-inch long 7/8 bolt, which is a big old bolt, and we have plenty of those on our farm, fortunately, and using some clamps, some plastic alligator clamps, to clamp it. So it basically was wrapped around it, and then I put it in the oven. And the first time I put it in the oven was at like 200 for, 15 minutes, and it just did not take a set. It still had a lot of spring to it. So I thought, well, let's get serious. And I put it back in the oven at 325 for about half an hour, thinking, well, you know what? The melting point of styrene is above 400. This should be fine. And it was. I mean, it did, in fact, work well. I had a perfectly formed sheet of styrene into what was basically now a tube that I cut a section out of. But my alligator clamps apparently have a lower than polystyrene melting point because they got destroyed. So whatever, the sacrifice of 3 little plastic clamps for a perfectly shaped blade section was no big deal. Anyway, these are the lessons we learned. Another lesson I learned was I probably should have used brass for the pivot on this thing. It's not intended to actually swing, but it is a little bit flimsy, you can see. This whole thing is a little flimsier than I'd like for it to be. But, as long as it survives through the photographs, I guess I'll be okay. Anyway, I think that pretty well covers all of the sort of construction and engineering and drama and all of that. And the only thing left really to say is maybe with respect to the overall weathering. As you can see, I just finished doing the weathering a couple of days ago, and I've got my whole array of MIG products out here. And I love this stuff. They are so easy to work with. They're enamel products, and he gives you a number of things that are, mixed for your convenience, like fuel stains, fresh engine oil, which is nice because it gives a little bit of a gloss, and you can see like where I used that on the oil filler cap, right there, that it's got a little bit of a sheen to it, which is nice, gives you a little bit more realism. It's just good stuff, and it's fun to work with because you can create such realism. I used the pigment sparingly. One of the places was right here on the air filter, because that's an oil bath air filter, so that canister is full of oil. And invariably they leak and slosh around, and so you always get this cake of dirt soaked with oil on the outsides of those things. And the pigment and various substances work really good to reproduce that. If you're not into weathering, if you haven't tried any of this stuff, I would encourage you to go and just get into it, because the products are there that can help you out, and they really are a lot of fun. Now, the rust, I think, is really what I should probably finish up with talking about, because for me, the rust was kind of what defined this whole project. And I really wanted to try and get as realistic as I could at showing not only paint that was flaking off, but paint that has just been worn away by the effects of sun and wind and, just use and abuse. And they're two different things. Chipping is relatively straightforward because you're just knocking the paint off, and you want those little hard-edged chips. But the other kind of wear, where it's just that gradual fade and abrasion, is a little bit different, and takes a little bit different approach. So the way that I did this is my first my first task was to do the rust base layer, and that is just my rust colored mix of Stynylrez that I have handy for that. So I put that down, and then I used a couple of different layers of ammo rust enamel colors, rust colored pigment, some sponge work, some very, just to create a little bit of subtle variety in that rust tone. And you can see some of that here in the hood where there's some slightly different oranges in there. Then what I did, because I wanted to make sure that all of that was protected, I put a layer of aqua gloss over it because I know that that stuff is relatively hard wearing. But I also did it for another reason. Going back to what I was talking about before, with the chipping being so difficult on all of this red paint, I came to two conclusions. One is that while MRP chips pretty well on top of itself, as in different colors of MRP, it does not want to come loose from Stynylrez. And, as Jimmy D laughingly pointed out, that's probably something that I should have predicted, given that a primer is designed for stuff to stick to it. But whether it's because of that or because it's a very matte finish, MRP does not want to chip easily off of Stynylrez. So, knowing that the aqua gloss would be a tough barrier layer and that it was going to be glossy, I thought, well, that will give me easier chipping. And in fact, it did. It was a good move. I still had trouble if I had the paint on too thick, which I did in a couple of places. But I was also more strategic about my spraying. And so the chipping on all of the gray paint went a lot better than it did on the red stuff. And I didn't end up having to get really medieval in more than just a couple of spots. But I also was strategic about how I sprayed it. So like on this area on the top of the hood and on the tops of the fenders, where I knew that paint was going to be gone completely and I wanted it to be thin, I just sprayed like only one layer. And so then, after it was dry, the first thing I did was come back and sand it a little bit. And that helped me get the sort of feathered edges on these areas that I wanted. Then I came back and did the chipping. And that was a good order of procedure. And I still found that I had a few places where the paint didn't want to shift. And so I ended up using steel wool dipped in water in a couple of places. And I would just kind of put it down and just kind of use it in a sort of jitterbug motion. And that worked pretty good to create some really nice braided effects. It's kind of difficult to see down inside there, but on the inside of that fender in particular, where I wanted to show that the paint was just starting to break down and that the iron oxide from the rust underneath was bleeding up through it, the steel wool and water worked pretty well. But the main thing with chipping, as always, is start with the least aggressive thing and work your way up. Because if it's super easy and you start out really medieval, then you're going to be sad because your paint's going to be flying off way more than you want it to. So I always start with the gentlest thing and work my way up to the gnarlier tools as I see how things are going to go. But anyway, that's kind of the basic rundown of how all of my rusting and weathering on the gray paint went. I did forget, I have a layer, you can kind of see it, of Tamiya Hull Red that's on top of the rust base to represent the primer layer that might have shown through. And that also is underneath the aqua gloss. So there's a bunch of layers going on there with all of this. The final rust effect with that more orange oxide bleeding up through the paint, that is oils. And I did that after I did all of the chipping, and everything that I had done before was locked in with a layer of flat coat, which in this case was specifically MRP Super Clear Matte. That is I think that's the best surface for me anyway for doing oil work on top of. I like the traction that oils get on a perfectly flat surface better than anything else. So anyway, just lots of layers, lots of work, lots of massaging to get those effects. One other effect that I'm pretty proud of that you can hopefully see is on both the seat and on the grater blade. And those are both achieved with Ushi van der Rosten's fantastic metallic powders. In the case of the greater blade, I laid down a layer of Guns GX2 Gloss Black so that I would have a nice surface, but I purposely did not polish it. I let it have just a little bit of texture. I didn't clean up the plastic or anything because I wanted the blade to have a little bit of a texture, and I knew I was going to be putting some dirt pigments on there anyway. And I'm really happy with the realism of that result of the polished blade surface, because that's 100% how they end up looking in real life. The other thing was I wanted the seat to show that kind of suggestion of rust, but that has been polished by somebody's butt and the denim jeans or whatever that they were wearing. And so I've got my Stynylrez Rust base on there with no clear coat on it, and then I rubbed the Ushi van der Rosten iron powder on top of that, and I feel like that's a pretty realistic effect. That looks a lot like the seat on the old Ford 8N that is here on our farm. So I feel pretty happy about that. One other thing that I should mention, I guess, before I forget, is how did I do the tires? Because I think people are going to wonder about that, given that they are that silly rubber stuff that nothing wants to stick to. And in fact, I could not get anything to stick to them. I experimented on the other set of front tires, which I was grateful that they provided those. And I tried raw pigment, and that did not hold on. You know, basically any amount of finger pressure would leave a fingerprint or just rub it right off. I tried using straight let's see, how did I go? I tried pigment. That didn't work. Then I used pigment fixer, and that didn't work a whole lot better, and it left it looking kind of crusty and just not right, so that didn't work. Then I tried using some of this earth enamel product, and all by itself that didn't stay on very well. And then, in just kind of a fit of curiosity, I applied some of my pigment fixer, and this is a bottle of AK, but it's exactly the same as the ammo stuff. It's just super thin, clear enamel varnish. I applied some of this pigment fixer on top of the enamel earth effects stuff. And in fact, the enamel earth effects stuff was still wet when I did it. And I was really liberal with both. I just sloshed the earth effect on there, and then I sloshed the pigment fixer on top of it. And what I noticed while I was watching was that it sort of caused that the fixer sort of caused the earth effect stuff to separate and give me that really random speckled effect that you can see on the side walls of the tires. And I was like stoked because I was watching this happen right before my very eyes, and I'm like, man, that's exactly the effect that I would have done if I could have figured out a way to do it. So I was really happy about that, and I can't explain why it works. I can only tell you that it does, and it is fairly robust. I mean, I'm not going to just, do a whole bunch of rubbing on that with my warm, sweaty hands, but I handled these tires as much as it took to install them and had no problems with fingerprints or any of it flaking off or anything. So, hey, again, I don't know why it works, but it did, and I was really happy with the effect. I found that I was still able to come back and on the raised portions of the tread where I wanted to remove it, just use a Q-tip soaked in mineral spirits and wipe it off. And it worked pretty well. You may notice that one tire is more worn than the other, and I did that on purpose. I wanted to have one of the tires look like it was pretty old and ragged. And it's a good thing I only wanted one because that was a lot of work. These vinyl things, trying to sand them, Dudes, I tried so many things. I put them in the freezer thinking, well, if they're harder, then that may help. Didn't work. I put some clear acrylic varnish on it, thinking, or clear lacquer varnish, thinking, well, that'll kind of soak in and give me a hard surface that'll be easier to sand. And nope, that didn't work. Had to remove all that. And ultimately what ended up working the best was just using my Proxxon with a sanding drum on it and just brute force removing all of the tread, which then left me with a bunch of little crazy strings and nubs and just, fuzzies hanging off all around the outside of the tire that were almost, I tried cutting them off, clipping them off with little clippers. It was a huge pain in the ass. And the crazy thing that ended up working really well for removing all of those little nubbles was using a yellow cloth buffing wheel on my Proxxon. And again, I don't really know why it works. Maybe it's because the layers of cloth in the buffing wheel just do a good job of grabbing all of those little nubbles. I don't know, but it ended up cleaning them up really well. So there you go. Maybe this is why this project took me 2 months, because I ended up having to experiment on a number of things to get the effects that I wanted. But ultimately, I feel like it was worthwhile, and hopefully, with all my rambling here, I've been able to pass on some of that experience to you guys. But anyway, I think that's it. I think that's enough gabbing about the story of the little Ferguson. Okay, so there you go. Yeah, I know that's going to end up being long. But like the project itself, longer than anticipated, because it just ended up being a lot more intense and a lot more involved than I expected it to be. I went into it, at least in my mind anyway, committed to doing everything that I could think of to raise the level of detail and create the highest level of realism that I knew how to. And I feel pretty happy with the results. I mean, I guess you guys will let me know if I'm wrong about that, but it ended up being a lot of fun, a lot of learning that I think I can carry on to other projects of this type. So I guess it was all worth the extra time spent, but I'm definitely ready to move on to something new. So with that, I'm sure you guys are also ready to move on to something besides listening to me flap my lips. So with that, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that it was somehow informative, and that you guys will be inspired to go out and get your own tractor and make it rusty and dusty, because it is definitely a lot of fun. One of the most fun things I've done since I came back to model making. Anyway, as always, guys, I definitely appreciate you watching. Take care. Much love.